special. I have a great friend at RMJ Tactical. His name is Ryan Burkhart. Ryan, thank you very much for this amazing gift that you have loaned me, at least for the next few weeks, so that I can review it on my channel. Ryan, thank you very much. You're a wonderful friend. I actually have two magnificent weapons for us to take a look at. They are both from Biegler Blade Works. Biegler Blade Works is one of those amazing companies that has come up with amazing Filipino martial arts tools in their modern iterations, specifically the balisong and also a sansibar, which is a Filipino type of sword. But the ones I'm going to be reviewing today are going to be his very famous and really well executed Ginunting, and the other one is a collaboration with Pikiti Tirsha instructor Tim Wade, and we're going to be looking at his knife design, the Covert. This is in collaboration with Brian Biegler. Now, Brian Biegler is a very well-known martial artist as well, having a JKD background, but also with a great emphasis on Muay Thai. I just love seeing martial artists really just take control of their art, but most of all, take control of the weapons design so that we get to see what comes out of their minds, because they're also martial artists, and especially someone like Brian Biegler to go ahead and put his mind to focus on these Filipino martial arts. I'm really looking forward to taking a look at it. For those of you who remember, I had a chance to work with the Brian Biegler Ginunting when I was at Blade Show, and that was when Ryan loaned me this exact Ginunting. So and my first impressions there, really super light and super neutral balance, and wow, it was really fast and super intuitive in the hands. But now I get a second shot at it to work with it with you. So the first thing I want us to take a look at is the Ginunting. So now just some of the specs. Here's the handle, really nice puño, and if I'm not mistaken, this is an homage to some of the more traditional Ginuntings, where this one's a little bigger. In the traditional ones are slightly bigger. This one he modified so it's a little smaller. I happen to like it a lot. And you have some tapering here, which I also happen to like. You have this guard that angles down, so it's a nice stop for the index finger. Very, very sharp steel on this side. I believe is D2, could be wrong, but it also has this wonderful sharpened swedge on this side. And you know I'm a big fan of these sharpened swedges because it allows me to do a lot of things with the sword that normally isn't necessarily integrated with it as far as methodology is concerned. Just a little background on the Ginunting. From what I understand, the Ginunting is part of the Talibong family of Filipino swords. So it's not quite from the northern area, a little more on the Visayan area if I'm not mistaken. But the Ginunting, if I'm not mistaken, is a slightly more modern design. And in fact, although it comes from the Talibong family, so it's actually an older design, the ones that we see nowadays, especially the ones that are being used at the Force Marine Recon in the Philippines by their military personnel there, it's a little more modern, and if I'm not mistaken, is actually designed by the Pikiti Tirsha group. So a big part of what contributed to this design is that this is supposed to be a double duty tool. So the jungles of the Philippines are really more like thick vines and trees, so cutting through them requires an aggressive blade profile and a very aggressive design, so that if they have to cut through these vines, it's something that they could do with a lot of ease. And the one thing I really love about the Ginunting design is that it follows Bill Bagwell's leading edge philosophy. Meaning, if I were to reverse this, let's imagine that this is a more traditional sword and the edge is on this side. What happens is that when I cut this way, notice how if the target is along the center line and I cut this way, my hand gets to the center line before my edge does. And that is what's called flesh leading steel. And among Filipinos, this is exactly what we want, because as I'm coming towards you this way to strike you, you have the opportunity to hit my hand. What Bill Bagwell did, as far as the Bowie knife is concerned, is with that false edge, it allowed it so that it is steel leading flesh with the back cut. But what the Ginunting does is, rather than doing the back cut movement, we can just do a conventional angle 1 or angle 2, and notice that as the angle starts to lead forward, notice that at the last second, I can turn my hand this way, and so now flesh is behind steel, steel is leading flesh. This is one of the important things I love about the Ginunting, not only because of its relatively neutral balance and the fact that it moves very quickly, it also, by design, leads flesh. That way my hand is safe every time I'm going towards a cut. I really love the Ginunting design because of this. However, the other thing we cannot forget is the fact that it has this sharpened swedge. And this sharpened swedge ensures that this is not just your conventional angle 2, angle 1, and now I don't have any sort of half beat counter. I do have a half beat counter. It's this sharpened swedge. So it's angle 1, cut, angle 2, and cut. So now I can start to put together my beat structures in a way so that I can really fire off super rapid strikes when I'm using this sword. Final thing I want us to consider when it comes to the Ginunting is the lack of that belly swell. When a sword has a belly swell, it actually adds to its weight distribution in terms of how it falls forward. But because that belly swell does not exist on this sword, it doesn't fall forward. It's neutral no matter how many fingers I open. So it's the kind of sword that fires off of the tricep line, meaning my elbow is actually what launches the sword forward. It's going to be very interesting to move with because my initial instinct is that this is going to be a sword that likes to fire off of short, rapid witticks with some power assists, and I really like that idea. So when I move with this Ginunting and as I show you what it is capable of, keep in mind what methodologies I'm going to be using with it, and a lot of it is probably going to be around those shorter kind of strikes. The other Biegler design that I have with me is the Covert. Now the Covert is a Tim Wade design that he collaborated with Brian Biegler on, and I really love so many things about this fixed blade because when you first take a look at it, it seems like, okay, it's really straightforward, but when you take a closer look, you're like, all right, I can see some of the things that you did here. One, a super reinforced tip here. So it's more of a triangular tip, so this isn't flat. There's some raises over here, so it's a super triangular tip, so that from a penetration standpoint, this is going to be very strong. You have this nice thumb ramp on this nice ramp over here, so that if I have to do any sort of fine work, some modified foil grip, I can do some fine work using my finger to support the spine of the knife. You also have this choil here so that there's no slippage, but if I decide to go into an earth grip or a pikal grip, it really lands there very nicely, whether it's the palm or it happens to be the pinky. So it's very nice that way. You have this somewhat triangulated puño over here. So in case I have to shatter some sort of windshield or I have to use it as a type of puño impact, it's there as well. But the balance is such so that it's a little forward. So if I hold it this way, it likes to tip forward. And what I like about that is that when you have a knife, especially a small one that likes to tip forward, what that does is that it makes it easier to manipulate. So it's easier for me to manipulate going from heaven grip and I let it drop. And when I let it drop, it goes easily into earth grip. And that's really nice and cool because if you're doing any sort of drills relating to moving them around, it makes it very easy and very comfortable to work with. Not all knives are designed that way, and I really like that they designed it so that for knife manipulation, it's really comfortable and really enjoyable to work with. The other thing also I like about the Covert is how this blade profile is designed. So this is almost like a tanto because you have an edge on this side, and then you have another edge on this side. So it's almost like a tanto where it has these two edges in place. You have two kinds of cuts, one along the primary, and this is almost like a secondary type of edge, which I think is cool. But the other thing that I like also is that this edge here is somewhat concave. And that concave edge is is kind of an homage to the Chris blade, because you know the waviness of the Chris sword, those waves actually create, as you draw the sword, these kind of deeper cuts into the flesh of your target. And I think that's what it's designed for here. It has this little bit of a wave, so as you do a draw cut, it actually does this secondary cut here along this part, and then as you tilt it, it has this third cut here. I think that's really cool. I think that you can see just how well thought out this knife was. But it appears to be very strong based off of its design, the triangulated tip, this almost three cutting action along the edge, but of course that handle, which has this wonderful puño, the ability to be able to switch into any grip really comfortably, is something that I really enjoy. And what I'm going to do with both today is that one, I'm going to move with the Ginunting by itself, and then I'm going to move with them both, as you can see, really nicely as a type of espada y daga combination. So I really hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you for letting me share. Brian Biegler's Ginunting Sword is lightning fast. It's light, neutrally balanced, and lends itself really well to a lot of the stick-based martial arts that you find in Filipino martial arts. And I gotta tell you, I really like how this feels. Holy cow, it's really fast. So a bit of etymology here. Gunting in Tagalog means scissor. So the idea with a ginunting is that it is one part of a scissor. And what's interesting about this design is that swedge, that sharpened swedge. So think of it as one side of a scissor when I'm working with the primary edge, but then you have this other side of it, which is that sharpened swedge, which will allow for some back cutting movement. I'm not going to use it too much for back cutting because in the Ginunting design, that swedge is a trailing point, so it doesn't really take advantage of the back cut, which makes it a leading point. What I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be using a close quarters reverse slash. You see it a lot in Filipino martial arts where you kind of hug the sword to you. Another feature of the Ginunting that I really like, and it's really pronounced in traditional Ginuntings, is that pommel, because that pommel allows me to set up a slash, but then as I cut and slash across, I can grab the bottom of that pommel and then I can go ahead and two-hand it, so I can really apply some leverage into those cuts. So when I place it at the bottom of my palm, I can take advantage of the mechanoreceptors of my palm, so that entire tricep line activates as I drop my hips into that cut. It's really a disemboweling movement, a little more traditional to Japanese swordsmanship, so I love being able to combine that movement so I can slash right across with two-handing it. Not only does the sword design allow for it to move really well, the fact that there is an edge at the very top of the blade, but also that concave edge allows it to be one heck of a penetrating tool when it comes to thrusts. In fact, when Lynn Thompson was talking about his Cold Steel Frenzy, which is similarly designed, he said that it has a way of being able to push through the soft target but also easily extract. And so what that does is that it lends to its quickness even when it lands on soft targets. It allows for it to be able to thrust and then cut up. And that's one of the things that I like about how quickly it moves, because the idea is that it doesn't just move well because of its lightness. A lot of it is because of how that tip is designed in combination with that concave edge and that swedge at the top, which happens to be sharpened. That concave edge design also allows for it to have a little bit more range. If we take a look at a traditional itak design, take a look at when I extend my elbow, it doesn't really have a lot of reach. But then when I take the Ginunting, even in a neutral wrist position, it has an extra foot of reach. And that's what makes it a really capable tool that's great for the uses of the Force Recon Marines. I can use power biomechanics by using my hips and twisting along the waist to increase power. I think it's just good swordsmanship, but there's a casual cutting capability to this sword because of that sharpened swedge. Look how I can just walk up to a zombie, put it on his carotid, and then off I go. I can sever the carotid. I think it's just one of the things to remember about swordsmanship. There's skill, but then there's also this simplicity to it, that if you really want to take somebody out, it doesn't take a lot of effort, but it takes a lot of skill to be a good swordsman. So when I'm moving playing with it using these type of florete movements, I think it really lends itself to it really well. The Ginunting, however, because of that extended pommel, allows me to do a lot of things with it. It works as a counterbalance, I think, in many ways, but the way I like to use it is I grab the bottom end of it. So I'm going to put my left hand on my right forearm to fake a power assist to change the beat structure, also keep my distance, but when I grab the left pommel, I close the distance by cutting across and then thrusting. This sword is really good also for mass attacks. It tends to be really fast and also allows me to move very differently with these wide swings. Wide swings generally are good for mass attacks, but its mechanics are a little different because of that concave edge. It's a little lighter and it doesn't have that kind of momentum that it builds when you start to swing. But I really like it because of that sharpened swedge. I can do a lot of multi-directional attacks that aren't necessarily part of a sword curriculum when you're moving with wide swings. So right now when I'm going ahead and slashing and thrusting, what you're seeing here is some of that lightness come into play because as I slash across, I can thrust. Really wonderful in this type of play. However, when I start to move with it in slightly bigger movements, it doesn't give me that kinesthetic feedback that allows me to coil my core and fire from my core. In fact, it kind of forces me to stay arm-centric, and arm-centric movements doesn't really transfer well into itak movements. So once you see me move with the itak, and this is a wooden version of it, I actually end up hitting the wall a couple of times because the movements are just so different. The kinesthetic awareness is different because it's a different sword. So Ginunting movements and biomechanics is specific to the Ginunting. I've handled traditional Ginuntings that are a little more tip heavy that allows me to get that kinesthetic feedback to coil my core, and I think that's great. But what Brian Biegler has done is taken the Ginunting and made it more accessible for the Filipino martial artist who comes from a primarily stick-based background, who's very arm-centric. And I think it's great for them because it's very plug-and-play. You don't need to go and learn another sword art or sword curriculum or different set of biomechanics. When you're ready to use the sword, pick up a Brian Biegler Ginunting because it's just gonna go with any of the styles that you have that are stick-based. Balintawak, Doce Pares, Pikiti Tirsha, which originated the modern design of the Ginunting. It's just going to flow right through with your stick-based art, and I think that makes it phenomenal. Take a look at all the movements that I'm doing here. This isn't sword-based. This is all Filipino martial arts stick-based movements. You put a stick in my hand and it's going to move exactly the same. Most Filipino swords don't lend themselves well to stick movements like these abanicos and redondos, but here you can see it, abanico, and then I can go ahead and cut down and thrust. So it's really light and well balanced that way. Use some power assists with this so that it still behaves like a sword, although it feels like a stick. Redirecting with this sword is an absolute breeze because of its neutral balance. So if I go ahead and do a strike that has a downward trajectory, I can do an upward strike on it without having to use two hands. Because normally with a heavy sword, like a Filipino sword that's traditional, you need two hands to kind of power stop it to help redirect it because it has its own momentum. But this one, you can redirect it with just one hand. I'm going to go ahead and use some of the power stopping using my left hand just out of habit, but just to show you that it's not necessary. Here I'm going to go ahead and do a downward strike and then stop it with my left hand. That's a good habit from traditional sword work, but this is a Biegler Ginunting. You don't necessarily need that. You can just use one hand and cut right across with that sharpened swedge and be completely fine doing it. Now we're going to work with the Tim Wade designed Covert and take a look at how easily and how fluidly I can switch grips with this. And a lot of that comes from, and I believe that they were intentional about this, because it moves a lot like a balisong. So it's a fixed blade that moves like a balisong. So you can use the same mechanics of flipping a balisong open. That way you can change a lot of your gripping. Now I'm going to do some traditional Filipino knife movements, and you want to hear something weird? The Ginunting has a very neutral balance, so it has no momentum of its own. But this one has a slightly tip-heavy balance, so it has its own momentum. So once I start to move with the knife, it actually starts to move on its own. That's why it feels a lot like a balisong when I move with it. The knife itself is doing a lot of this movement all of its own. And that's something that I find really cool. So you see me manipulating it easily with the grip. That's a lot of balisong movement. But what it does, it gives me a lot of gripping options. I don't necessarily like a lot of knife work that's on the small side, because if it's small, it doesn't have momentum. But Tuhan Tim Wade and Brian Biegler figured it out. This has a different kind of weight balance, so that it actually moves really well because it has its own momentum. Very different from the Ginunting. So I think it's a bit of a great and very well appreciated flip the script there, where the bigger sword doesn't have momentum, but the small knife does. So now I'm going to move with the Ginunting and the Covert in some traditional San Miguel movements with Espada y Daga. The Espada y Daga curriculum is one of those highly overlooked curriculums in Filipino martial arts because it teaches you a very complex skill, which is how to switch leads with two weapons of varying lengths. So switching leads is a very much sought after skill in Filipino martial arts and in weapons altogether. It looks really easy, but frankly, it's very difficult to do. So moving in the Espada y Daga method using both Bieglers, the Ginunting and the Covert, take a look at how that knife goes from earth grip, then switch over to heaven grip. Really fantastic. But look at how the Ginunting does a lot of the cover for it. It covers a lot of the movements of the knife. So kind of similar concept when we move with the Spanish Navaja with the cloak. The cloak covers the movement of the Navaja. The Ginunting covers the movements of the dagger. By switching lead shoulders, what you're seeing me do here is a little more of the San Miguel strategy, where I let the sword do a lot of the slashes so it can cover for the coup de grace, which happens to be the knife. Now I'm going to switch over to some of the Ginunting methodology. The Gunting methodology is that I isolate the weapon arm and I do this slashing movement where both hands come together and I'm cutting the brachial artery, the radial nerve, the radial tendon, and defanging the snake. So that's one of the key strategies I like to use and train with when I'm playing with Espada y Daga, which is the Ginunting method, where I come right down to that arm line and cut right across. So I really hope that you enjoyed this video and some of the key takeaways I've taken from moving with them. One, the neutral balance of the Ginunting, really enjoyable, really fantastic, but you won't be able to load your core as well as a traditional sword, a traditional Filipino sword. But I'll tell you, that Tim Wade designed Covert, that one is really fantastic. I'm going to do a separate video on both. Stick around, stay tuned. Really hope you enjoyed it. More videos to come.